What was Sauron's master plan? How did he plan to win the War of the Ring? And what were his first steps? Let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to Deep Geek. On this channel we cover the Lord of the Rings in nerdy detail, as well as other great fantasy worlds like A Song of Ice and Fire and The Witcher. Welcome. This is the start of a short series of videos looking at the story behind the story of the Lord of the Rings, the story of the War of the Ring, where armies of orcs, humans, elves, dwarves, Nazgul and Oliphaunts clashed across Middle-earth with all the tragedy and horror and heroism that brought. And this time we'll focus in on what Sauron's plan for the war actually was. And let's start with the simple fact that this is a war that Sauron wants. In every war there is an aggressor, the side that first invades the other or fires the first shot, and in this case it is Sauron. Of course it is. He wants to rule all of Middle-earth. Over the years and millennia, Sauron had tried to subjugate Middle-earth several times, most recently with the War of the Last Alliance of Elves and Men at the end of the Second Age. At the end of that, the One Ring was cut from Sauron's finger and subsequently lost, and Sauron himself was vanquished, but not gone for good. The elves and humans kept a long, watchful vigil for his return. Gondor built a series of defences and watchtowers around Mordor, just in case, and 1,000 years into the age, Gandalf was dispatched by the Valar along with the other Istari to help support, encourage and guide this effort. And eventually, Gandalf did manage to track down Sauron. He had been hiding in southern Mirkwood in the stronghold of Dol Guldur under the disguise of the Necromancer. He had been regathering his strength there for centuries. There's a bit of history here about Gandalf's growing suspicions and previous expeditions to Dol Guldur, but the decisive moment was in the year 2941 of the Third Age, when Gandalf finally persuaded the White Council to join him to attack Dol Guldur. That's what Gandalf was doing when he went missing in The Hobbit. Sauron is forced to flee to Mordor and formally re-announces himself to the world a few years later. Gandalf had long suspected war was coming, but this was what finally drew Sauron into the open. Actually, Gandalf had been concerned that whenever the war came, he knew war was inevitable with Sauron around. Sauron would try to leverage Smaug's presence in the Lonely Mountain. He thought, probably rightly, that the elves of northern Mirkwood, Lothlorien and maybe even Rivendell would be exposed to possible dragonfire attack if Smaug wasn't dealt with, hence Gandalf's support for the quest for Erebor. And although the events that unfolded in that story are too far removed from the War of the Ring to be counted as part of that war, they did undoubtedly impact heavily on the geopolitical situation in northwest Middle-earth. The elves were freed from the threat of Smaug, the goblin and orc kingdoms around the Misty Mountains were weakened, Erebor became a dwarf stronghold once more, and Dale was repopulated as well, leading to a strong alliance between dwarves and men, all of which proved important in that later war. Of course, the most important thing that happened in 2941 during the quest for Erebor was the One Ring passing into the hands of Bilbo Baggins. Gandalf had his suspicions about it at the time, but no one truly understood then the significance of what had happened, and were focused on other things anyway. We'll come on to the ring again in a second because it's clearly important, but let's focus now on the more conventional war preparations, because both sides spent the next few decades slowly preparing for war. This was always going to be another war of two massive blocks facing against each other. Saruman's forces were a bit of a wild card later on, but overall we are looking at the nations of the east and south of Middle-earth, Mordor, Rhûn, Harad and so on, against Gondor and their allies Rohan, the last remnants of the once mighty elven kingdoms, and the dwarves with their human allies. It is 77 years from Bilbo's adventures in The Hobbit to the start proper of The Lord of the Rings, when Gandalf tells Frodo what his ring actually is, and Sauron uses that time to amass his forces and defences, starting with calling the 9 ringwraiths back to him in Mordor. They hadn't been quiet all the time before then, incidentally. The Witch King in particular had spent a very long time destroying and undermining Arnor and Gondor, the kingdoms descended from the Númenóreans, Sauron's old enemies. The world would have looked very different but for that. Sauron taking this time to build his army means that it was huge by the start of the war. As well as his own orcs, there were trolls, half-trolls from Far Harad, wargs, men from Harad, Easterlings from Rhûn, naval support from the Corsairs of Umbar. Basically, most of the east and south of the map of Middle-earth that we know swore fealty to Sauron. And he also built up his support structures for the war. We get a brief glimpse of this when Sam and Frodo make it into Mordor in the book. The camera sort of zooms out and Tolkien tells us a little of what is there. Neither he, Sam, nor Frodo knew anything of the great slave-worked fields away south in this wide realm, beyond the fumes of the mountain by the dark, sad waters of Lake Nirnan, nor of the great roads that ran away east and south to tributary lands, from which the soldiers of the tower brought long wagon trains of goods and booty and fresh slaves. Here in the northward regions were the mines and forges and the musterings of long-planned war. Basically, Sauron had his support infrastructure and logistics sorted out. His army was kitted out with weapons and armour, food grown to feed them, and it all paid for by funds extracted from tributary nations. And the army was massive and growing all the time. Frodo and Sam spy what is effectively an ad hoc city built on the plain of Gorgoroth inside Mordor, where his soldiers gathered and waited for the order to advance. And that Oliphaunt that Sam saw outside Mordor, that was part of even more forces rallying to Sauron's call. Tolkien doesn't give us many precise numbers, but at the final Battle of the Morannon, the battle that took place just outside Mordor while Frodo and Sam were actually at Mount Doom, there seem to have been in excess of 60,000 in the Dark Lord's army. You can add to that the numbers he had committed and lost in the attacks on Osgiliath and Minas Tirith, the force that crossed the Anduin at Caer Andros, his allies the Corsairs of Umber, and the significant forces that attacked various northern targets at the same time. We'll cover all of those things later in the series, but overall it's fair to say that at the start of the War of the Ring, Sauron had well in excess of 100,000 troops at his disposal, plus elite servants like the Nazgul. Then there were Sauron's alliances. Primary among these, of course, was Saruman, who was amassing his own army of orcs and Dunlendings. It's unlikely that Sauron ever 100% trusted Saruman, but he certainly put in the time to get him on side. The strategy here is pretty straightforward. Saruman was based at Isengard, which guarded the only real way through the massive mountain ranges that split Middle-earth into western and eastern halves. Yes, there are passes through the Misty Mountains, but if you want to march an army through, the Gap of Rohan really is the only overland route for hundreds of miles. Even if Saruman betrayed Sauron, he could still be counted on to keep Rohan occupied, preventing them from supporting Gondor when Sauron attacked them. At least, that was the plan. And Sauron was also trying to undermine Gondor via the Palantiri. He found that he couldn't dominate Denethor's mind as he had wanted to. Denethor really had an astonishingly powerful mind for a human, living up to his Númenórean heritage, but he did manage to repeatedly show Denethor the might of Mordor growing, and make him fearful, defeatist, and on the defensive, and we know how that ended. In the short term, though, it meant that whereas Denethor supported limited guerrilla warfare against Sauron's forces led by Faramir's Rangers, he never really contemplated anything more offensive, leaving Sauron the space to build his forces in peace. Facing Sauron were the elves, who were severely depleted in numbers, dwarves, who had also fallen from the height of their powers, and humans. Of the two great successor powers to Númenor, Gondor and Arnor, Arnor had been destroyed in a long campaign by the Witch King of Angmar centuries earlier, and Gondor, well, we've just talked about Gondor, they would be formidable opponents still, but if they could be isolated, there was no reason to think that Minas Tirith wouldn't eventually fall. All told, Sauron's army was better prepared, more united, and several times the size of their opponents. We can say with quite a lot of certainty that had this come down to just one army against another, then Sauron would have won. This clear disparity in army sizes played into both sides' strategies for the war. Gandalf, Elrond, Galadriel and co. clearly decided that they couldn't just march on Mordor and expect to win, hence the stealth mission to destroy the ring, a reliance on surprise attacks and pinch points at places like the Hornburg and the Pelennor Fields, and high-risk gambles like Aragorn's rallying of the army of the dead. Sauron, on the other hand, seems mostly to have relied on brute force, combined with dividing and conquering his enemies. Breaking that down a little bit more, his plan was to focus first with the bulk of his forces on eliminating Gondor as a threat. They were the largest single force opposing him. He would do that with a full frontal assault while preventing their allies from coming to their aid. This latter part of the plan meant simultaneously launching a wide series of smaller attacks along the Gondorian coast against Lothlorien, Northern Mirkwood, Dale and so on, and trying to prevent the famed Riders of Rohan from aiding their Gondorian allies. Sauron didn't mind losing troops in this, he had plenty to spare, and he even kept most of his forces back in reserve right until the very end. Given his overwhelming dominance in conventional forces, it actually seems like a pretty solid plan. As a magical world, we have to acknowledge that there remained the possibility of either side doing things outside of conventional tactics. On the Free People's side, this obviously included Aragorn calling on the dead men of Dunharrow, the Ents marching on Isengard, and so on. But Sauron wasn't without his own bits of magic to fortify his army. We're told that he gave the Witch King added demonic force before the final battles, gave all of the Nazgul fell beasts to ride, and had his forges create magical weapons to aid their fight. We saw one in Grond, the battering ram, which breached Minas Tirith's famed gates with ease, and I have speculated elsewhere that Sauron had been stockpiling Mithril to make more of such magical weapons to target other enemy strongholds. At which point, we should return to the subject of the One Ring. All this talk of amassing armies and planning for a ground invasion of Middle-earth might give the impression that Sauron had overlooked the One Ring or decided that he didn't need it. Nothing could be further from the truth. He was obsessed with it. He knew that with it he would be whole again and immensely more powerful. I'm sure in his own mind he would have been unstoppable. The power of the 3 elven rings would have been broken. Elrond, Galadriel and Gandalf would have had to take them off, and his darkness would have soon dominated the continent. At least, that's how Elrond seems to have understood the situation at the Council of Elrond. Of course, if someone else got a hold of the ring and used it to launch their own plans to dominate the world, things would be a whole lot harder for Sauron, and that's what Sauron was convinced anyone would try to do if they got the ring. And now he had reason to believe that the ring had been found. When he called evil things to him in Mordor, rallying his troops, Gollum had been drawn there. He was captured, interrogated, and Sauron discovered about Baggins and Shire. He sent an emissary to the dwarves of Erebor in case they knew what and where that was, sent out orc hunting parties, and released Gollum back into the wild, hoping that he would be drawn to it and Sauron could take it from him. Eventually, he even sent out the Nazgul, his most powerful and loyal servants, uncloaked and invisible, to hunt it down. In short, it was obviously in Sauron's best interests to hunt for the ring, but to do so in as low-key a way as possible. He didn't really want the opposition knowing what he knew or what he was up to. How this tied into his war plans was that he knew that he now had to go on the offensive after all that time amassing his armies. He couldn't run the risk that someone else might use the power of the ring to rally their forces against him. Much better to attack now and seize the advantage. Added to which, it would be easier to find the ring in territory he occupied with an enemy defeated. As we noted at the start of this video, he was the aggressor here. His closest and strongest enemy was Gondor, so he'd start there. The rest could wait. Anyway, all of this brings us to the acknowledged first real battle of the War of the Ring, Sauron's attack on Osgiliath on June the 20th, 3018 of the Third Age. To put this into the context of the main story, at this point Gandalf had just told Frodo about the One Ring, but Frodo had yet to leave Bag End. Things were still very calm in the Shire. Anyway, Osgiliath was a strategically important city, and a symbolically important one too. For a long time it was the capital of Gondor, before Minas Tirith. However, at the time of the War of the Ring it was largely abandoned, although a Gondorian garrison was often placed there to protect the main bridge that crossed the wide Anduin River. Osgiliath was attacked by a small army from Mordor, led by the Nazgul. Boromir and Faramir led the resistance for Gondor and ended up pushing the enemy back and destroying the bridge over the Anduin, so a bit of a draw all in all. That initial battle over, Sauron went back to gathering his forces for a while and sent the Nazgul out on the quiet to try to find the ring. Boromir, meanwhile, headed off in search of Rivendell, and Faramir stayed in the area of Ithilien, to the east of the Anduin River, with some rangers doing some guerrilla warfare against any of Sauron's forces who ventured that far out. Frodo and Sam find him there doing just that, much later in the story when they pass by that way. Although it might seem like a bit of a damp squib of a start to a war, Sauron's intention at this point seems not so much to kick-start his invasion as just test out Gondor's defences and misdirect his opponents. By attacking with just a fraction of his forces and committing the Nazgul there, he probably bought them a bit of time when he immediately sent them out incognito, or as incognito as they ever could be, to hunt for the ring. Sauron also seems to have concurrently launched a small raid against the elves of northern Mirkwood, freeing Gollum. So this first phase of the war was actually relatively low-key. Just one notable battle and a few skirmishes, and then everyone settled down to a sort of phony war that lasted a few months. Frodo and then the Fellowship made their way eastwards. The Ringwraiths were out searching for the ring until they got washed away outside Rivendell, and everyone was marshalling their forces and defences. But Sauron's plan was in place. He had tested Gondor's defences, sent his top team out to hunt for the ring, put in place plans to keep the elves, dwarves and Rohan out of the war for a time, and would now gather his own forces for a spring offensive against Minas Tirith. The stage was set for the War of the Ring. Next time, we'll look at Saruman's master plan. How had he expected to win the War of the Ring? Because he did have a master plan, as short-lived as it was. My War of the Ring playlist is on the left of your screen now, or if you'd like to see more videos on other aspects of the world of J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, please click on the link to the playlist in the centre of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.